If JonBenet Ramsey were alive today, she would be turning 36 years old. Instead, she's remembered as the 6-year-old girl found dead in her family's basement on the morning after Christmas, 1996, a case that has never been solved. For 20 years, her older brother, the only other child in that house that night, said almost nothing publicly. Then, in 2016, at 29 years old, Burke Ramsey sat down for his first ever interview and said something that few people expected to hear directly from him. "I know people think I did it," he said, "that my parents did it." What he said next, and what's happened to him in the years since, deserves to be told accurately because so much of what circulates about Burke Ramsey today has little to do with what he actually said, or with where he actually stands now, nearly 10 years later, in 2026. This is the story of Burke Ramsey, built from his own documented words, the forensic record, and verified reporting on his life today, not tabloid speculation. Before we go further, if you want true crime coverage built on documented fact instead of internet rumor, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you catch our next deep dive. This case has generated more unproven theories aimed at a child, who is now a grown man, than almost any case in modern true crime history. If that matters to you, hit that like button and tell us in the comments what you actually know about Burke Ramsey versus what you've simply heard repeated online. Now, let's go back to who he was before any of this, because that context tends to disappear entirely in nearly 30 years of retelling. Burke Ramsey was born in 1987, the second child of John and Patsy Ramsey, arriving 3 years before his younger sister. His father, John, was by 1996 the successful CEO of Access Graphics, a computer services company that had grown into a $1 billion-a-year subsidiary of a major aerospace contractor. His mother, Patsy, was a former Miss West Virginia who had traded pageant competition for motherhood, remaining, by every account from friends and family, warm, socially active, and deeply attached to her children. The family lived in a large Tudor-style home on 15th Street in Boulder, Colorado, roughly 7,000 square feet spread across multiple floors, with a sprawling, somewhat labyrinthine basement containing a boiler room, several storage areas, and, importantly for understanding Burke specifically, an elaborate model train layout he had built himself and spent countless hours maintaining and expanding. By every documented account from teachers, neighbors, and family friends, Burke was, by 1996, an entirely ordinary 9-year-old boy. He was described as quieter and more reserved than his younger sister, with a genuine, deep interest in computers, video games, and model trains, interests that would, decades later, translate directly into his adult career in technology. His relationship with JonBenet had the typical ups and downs of siblings 3 years apart in age, nothing more, nothing less, and nothing in the documented record from before December of 1996 suggests any pattern of concerning behavior, any history of aggression, or any red flags ever raised by teachers, pediatricians, or family friends. This matters because so much of the speculation that would later follow Burke rested entirely on inference constructed after the fact, working backward from an unimaginable tragedy rather than forward from any actual documented pattern of behavior beforehand. The week leading up to JonBenet's death was, by every account, an ordinary and happy one for the Ramsey family. On December 23rd, the family hosted their own holiday gathering, welcoming 30 to 40 guests to their home, including a family friend who dressed as Santa Claus for the children. Burke and JonBenet, along with the other children present, decorated gingerbread houses together. Later that same evening, the family attended a second party at the home of close friends, Fleet and Priscilla White. On Christmas Day itself, the family opened presents together at home. JonBenet received a bicycle she had wanted. The family shared a meal and spent the day together as any family might on Christmas. That evening, December 25th, the Ramseys attended a Christmas gathering at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, the same close friends from days earlier. According to the family's consistent account, both children fell asleep on the relatively short drive home afterward. John carried JonBenet up to her bedroom. Burke went to his own room. By every documented account from that entire day and evening, it was an unremarkable end to an ordinary, happy holiday. Burke had no reason to believe anything was wrong that night, and nothing in the documented record suggests he did. Early the next morning, his mother Patsy discovered that JonBenet was missing from her bedroom. along with a 3-page ransom note left on the home's spiral staircase, demanding $118,000 for her return, an amount that closely matched a bonus John had recently received from his employer. What followed was chaos. Police arrived within minutes of Patsy's frantic 911 call. Family friends began arriving at the house throughout the morning to offer support. Burke was checked on by his parents and confirmed to be safely asleep in his own room. Hours later, around 1 in the afternoon, his sister's body was discovered in a small storage room in the basement of their own home. Burke, 9 years old, was suddenly, and as it would turn out, permanently, at the center of a homicide investigation that would consume the remainder of his childhood and a substantial portion of his adult life as well. It's worth pausing here to note something that deserves far more attention than it typically receives in retellings of this case. Burke being removed from the home that morning, taken to stay with a family friend while investigators worked the scene, has occasionally been characterized online as somehow suspicious, as though it reflected a deliberate effort to isolate him. It wasn't anything of the sort. Removing other children from a traumatic scene as quickly as possible is standard, humane, universally applied practice in any child homicide investigation, both to protect the children emotionally and to preserve the integrity of an active crime scene. It reflects basic child welfare protocol, consistently applied across law enforcement agencies nationwide, not investigative suspicion directed specifically at Burke. Despite this, and despite there being no evidence whatsoever connecting him to what had happened, Burke found himself, from a very young age, at the center of theories that had almost nothing to do with actual evidence, and almost everything to do with the simple, uncomfortable fact that he was one of a small number of people inside the house that night. Because there was no clear sign of forced entry, investigators were required, as a matter of standard procedure in any homicide investigation, to consider and rule out everyone with access to the residence, including a 9-year-old child. That standard, appropriate investigative step became, over the following decades, the seed from which years of tabloid speculation, and eventually a major television documentary theory, would grow. For the next 2 full decades, Burke said essentially nothing publicly about any of this. He gave no interviews as a teenager navigating middle and high school under a level of public scrutiny almost no child in America has ever experienced. He gave no interviews in his early 20s as he attended college and began building a career. He simply grew up, largely, though never entirely, out of public view, while his name and childhood image continued circulating in tabloids, television specials, and, increasingly as the years passed, across an expanding universe of online true crime forums and amateur investigation communities built specifically around unresolved cases like his sister's. Then, in September of 2016, marking 20 years since JonBenet's death, Burke agreed to sit down with Dr. Phil McGraw for what became a 3-part television interview broadcast across consecutive days. His first public statement on the record about that night, and about the accusations that had followed him relentlessly into adulthood. What he actually said in that interview is worth hearing accurately and in real detail, because it's been paraphrased, exaggerated, taken out of context, and reframed so many times across nearly a decade of online discussion that the original substance of his words often gets lost entirely underneath layers of secondhand summary and speculation. Asked directly about that December morning, Burke described waking to chaos he didn't yet understand. "The first thing I remember is my mom bursting into my room really frantic, saying, 'Oh my gosh, oh my gosh,' running around my room," he said. "Now I know, looking for JonBenet." He described being taken to a family friend's house while investigators worked the scene inside his own home, a 9-year-old suddenly removed from everything familiar without any real explanation for why. He described learning sometime later, in a moment he still clearly remembered with real emotional weight 2 decades on, that his sister was dead. He addressed the theories that had followed him for 20 years directly, without deflecting, without hedging, and without waiting for the interviewer to push him toward the subject. "I know people think I did it," he said, "that my parents did it." He stated plainly, in his own words, that he had nothing to do with his sister's death, and that he had no memory of anything unusual happening that night beyond the chaos of the following morning. He also explained with what came across as genuine, unguarded candor why he had chosen to wait 20 full years before saying any of this publicly. "For a long time, the media basically made our lives crazy," he said. "It's hard to miss the cameras and news trucks in your front yard, and we go to the supermarket sometimes and there would be a tabloid with my picture, JonBenet's picture plastered on the front, or they would follow us around. Seeing that as a little kid is just kind of a chaotic nightmare, so I was pretty skeptical of any sort of media. It just made me a very private person." He added that the specific timing of the interview, coinciding precisely with the 20th anniversary of his sister's death, wasn't coincidental at all. "I guess I kind of wanted to make it about remembering her, and not just another news story." That last line deserves real sustained attention because it captures something genuinely consistent across essentially everything Burke has said or done publicly since. Even in his very first statement about the single worst experience of his life, delivered on national television to millions of viewers who had spent 2 decades speculating about him, his stated priority wasn't clearing his own name, generating sympathy for himself, or even directly defending his character at length. It was, in his own carefully chosen words, remembering his sister. That specific framing, choosing to center JonBenet rather than himself, even while directly and unambiguously addressing serious accusations against him, has remained remarkably consistent across every single documented public statement he's made in the years since. Some viewers of that 2016 interview noted that Burke smiled, occasionally and briefly, at certain moments, even while discussing genuinely serious and painful subject matter. Some found this unsettling, and some corners of the internet interpreted it, then and in years since, as evidence of guilt or as somehow sociopathic. It's worth addressing this directly and thoroughly, because it remains, to this day, one of the most frequently repeated criticisms of Burke's demeanor, and it genuinely deserves accurate, evidence-based context rather than continued speculation. Mental health professionals who have discussed this specific kind of reaction publicly, including in commentary specifically about this interview, have explained clearly that nervous smiling or laughing during extremely high-stress conversations is a well-documented, extremely common physiological and psychological stress response, not an indicator of a person's actual emotional state, sincerity, or truthfulness. Burke, giving his first public interview ever, at an age when he'd spent 2 full decades deliberately, consistently avoiding exactly this kind of intense public exposure, was almost certainly experiencing significant anxiety throughout that entire conversation. Interpreting that anxiety as evidence of guilt, rather than recognizing it as an ordinary, well-documented human response to an extraordinarily uncomfortable and unprecedented situation, simply isn't supported by anything beyond speculation and pattern matching to preconceived assumptions. Weeks after that Dr. Phil interview aired, CBS broadcast a 6-hour documentary event titled The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, marking that same 20th anniversary. The special assembled a panel of experts, including a retired FBI profiler, a forensic pathologist, and a former police chief, who conducted various physical experiments and detailed reconstructions throughout the series, working to build out possible scenarios, explaining what had happened inside the Ramsey home that night. Toward its conclusion, after hours of build-up, the documentary presented a specific theory suggesting that Burke, then 9 years old, might have struck his sister with an object, potentially causing the fatal injuries she suffered, possibly during some kind of dispute connected to the bowl of pineapple found in the family's kitchen the following morning, and that his parents subsequently deliberately staged an elaborate kidnapping scene to protect him from the consequences of what had happened. This was presented formally and explicitly as a theory, one interpretation constructed by the documentary's producers and consulted experts, among several the series explored, not as established, proven fact, and CBS never claimed otherwise on air at any point during the broadcast. But the framing and the sheer scale of the broadcast itself, 6 full hours of primetime programming spread across a major national network over consecutive nights, meant that a 9-year-old boy's name and his current adult face and voice became, for millions of viewers watching in 2016, permanently associated with the actual killing of his own sister. What consistently gets lost in casual retellings of this specific moment is a critical, easily verifiable timeline detail that fundamentally changes how the entire theory should be understood. DNA testing had already conclusively excluded Burke as the source of the unidentified male genetic material found on JonBenet's body and clothing, 17 full years before that CBS documentary ever aired, back in May of 1999. The forensic science that formally cleared him predates, by nearly 2 decades, the specific television broadcast that most casual observers of this case still, to this day, associate most closely with his name. For an ordinary viewer with no prior detailed familiarity with this case's DNA timeline, the documentary's dramatic staged reconstructions and confident expert commentary carried an authority and visual specificity that easily overwhelmed the far less dramatic, far less visually compelling underlying fact that rigorous scientific testing had already conclusively resolved the specific question of Burke's involvement 17 years earlier. 3 weeks after his Dr. Phil interview aired, and shortly after CBS's documentary broadcast its central theory to a national audience, Burke Ramsey filed a defamation lawsuit against CBS, the documentary's producers, and several of the specific experts featured prominently in the special, seeking $750 million in damages, an extraordinary figure that itself signals how seriously his legal team viewed the reputational harm involved. His legal team argued that the documentary had presented unproven, speculative theories in a manner specifically designed and calculated to lead reasonable viewers to conclude he had likely been responsible for his own sister's murder, causing severe, lasting, and quantifiable damage to his reputation, his career prospects, and his fundamental ability to live any kind of ordinary private adult life going forward. The case moved through the American legal system for several years, working through the kind of extended discovery process and pretrial proceedings typical of major high-stakes defamation litigation brought against a well-resourced national media company. In 2019, it was ultimately settled under undisclosed terms that have never been publicly revealed by either party to this day. CBS never issued any formal on-record retraction of the documentary's specific content, and settlements of this particular kind typically don't require one as a condition. But the sheer scale of the lawsuit, seeking $750 million, and critically, the fact that it was ultimately settled rather than fought all the way to a public jury verdict, strongly suggests his legal team believed they had built a genuinely strong, well-supported case, one carrying real, substantial legal exposure and financial risk for the network. Legal analysts and commentators who followed the litigation closely at the time noted publicly that defamation lawsuits of this particular magnitude, especially when brought against a major broadcaster with its own substantial legal resources and experienced defense counsel, are rarely settled unless the defendant's own legal team perceives genuinely meaningful risk of an unfavorable outcome at trial. Following that 2019 settlement, Burke largely retreated from public life entirely in a way that has proven remarkably consistent, complete, and durable in the years since, right up through 2026. According to public records reviewed and independently confirmed by multiple major news outlets over the years, he relocated from Colorado to Michigan and has worked steadily in technology management in the years following the CBS litigation's resolution. He has given essentially no further media interviews of any kind in the years since, choosing instead, deliberately and consistently, to build a private, genuinely ordinary adult life as far removed from cameras, journalists, and true crime coverage as the continued, seemingly permanent public fascination with his sister's still unsolved case would reasonably allow anyone in his specific position to actually achieve. That remarkable, sustained consistency matters enormously for understanding where Burke actually stands today, in 2026. Nearly a decade removed from his single public interview. In late 2024, Netflix released a new 3-part documentary series titled Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenet Ramsey, directed by an Academy Award-nominated filmmaker known specifically for meticulous, carefully sourced, fact-driven true crime storytelling rather than sensationalized speculation. The series revisits the case in significant depth, features an extensive, wide-ranging interview with John Ramsey, discussing what he believes were significant investigative errors made during the original 1996 investigation, and explores the ongoing, active push for advanced DNA testing that has continued developing throughout 2025 and into this year specifically. Notably and significantly for understanding this current chapter of the story, the director behind this new documentary publicly framed the entire project in a manner very different from how CBS framed its 2016 special. "There is nothing more horrific than an innocent child being murdered," the filmmaker said in comments accompanying the documentary's public release. But combine that with the false narrative that she was murdered by her own parents or her 9-year-old brother, and that's a horrifying tale. That specific framing, explicitly describing the theory implicating Burke as a false narrative rather than presenting it as a legitimate, still open investigative question worth exploring seriously, represents a genuinely meaningful shift in how at least some serious, credentialed documentary filmmakers now approach this specific aspect of the broader case, nearly a decade removed from CBS's markedly different treatment of that same underlying theory back in 2016. Despite that considerably more sympathetic, more evidence-grounded framing, Burke Ramsey was formally invited to participate in the Netflix project. He declined the invitation entirely. According to reporting on his specific decision, he cited his treatment by the media and online web sleuths as his stated reason for staying out of it completely, declining even a documentary project explicitly positioned by its own director as actively pushing back against the specific theory that had defined so much of his difficult adult public life following the CBS broadcast. It's a genuinely telling, remarkably specific choice of words, one that draws a direct, unmistakable line between the CBS documentary's lasting impact on his life nearly a decade earlier and his continued, deep, evidently unshakable caution around any project revisiting this case, even one framed explicitly and publicly around correcting the historical record on his behalf rather than casting renewed suspicion on him. It's worth genuinely sitting with that specific decision for a moment, because it tells us something honest and deeply human about where Burke Ramsey actually stands today, nearly 30 years removed from the single worst day of his childhood. This isn't, by any reasonable reading of the documented evidence, a man avoiding renewed scrutiny because he fears what some hypothetical new piece of evidence might reveal about his own involvement. The DNA evidence hasn't changed even slightly since 1999. It still doesn't match him. It never has across every single round of forensic testing conducted over nearly 3 decades of active investigation. What he appears to be genuinely consistently avoiding, based entirely on his own stated public reasoning, is the specific, well-documented, repeatedly demonstrated pattern of having his own words, his own image, and his own deeply personal life story repackaged, again and again, into content that treats a formally, scientifically DNA-excluded 9-year-old, now a man in his late 30s with an entirely ordinary career and private life, as an ongoing object of public suspicion, regardless of what the consistent physical evidence has actually and repeatedly shown for well over 2 decades running now. Let's be precise, thorough, and completely honest about what the actual forensic evidence in this case has always demonstrated, because it's genuinely the single most important thread running through Burke's entire personal story. And it's also, frustratingly, the specific part that gets repeated least accurately or most incompletely in casual online retellings of this case. DNA from an unidentified male was recovered from JonBenet's underwear in 1997, mixed with a small amount of blood found in that specific location. It was tested again in 2003, using considerably newer touch DNA technology capable of detecting genetic material from something as minimal as skin cell contact, and the exact same unidentified genetic profile was found a second time in a separate location on a completely different piece of clothing, her long underwear. That specific DNA profile has never, at any point across multiple independent testing rounds, matched Burke Ramsey. It has never matched his father, John. It has never matched his mother, Patsy. It has never matched any of the family friends who voluntarily submitted comparison samples during the original investigation. When compared against the FBI's National Criminal Database, it produced no match to any individual with a prior criminal record on file anywhere in the country. Burke specifically was formally scientifically excluded through direct DNA testing in May of 1999, meaning that more than 26 years ago now, hard physical, Scientific evidence had already definitively ruled him out as the source of that unidentified male DNA found on his sister's body and clothing. This specific timeline detail is genuinely crucial and frequently overlooked entirely in casual coverage of this case. The scientific DNA exclusion came a full 17 years before the CBS documentary that would go on to raise renewed widespread public suspicion about him in 2016. The underlying forensic science that definitively clears him predates by nearly 2 decades the specific television broadcast that many casual, less informed viewers of this case still, incorrectly, associate primarily with his name to this day. In 2008, then District Attorney Mary Lacey sent a formal, official letter directly to John Ramsey, officially and very publicly clearing the entire Ramsey family, John, Patsy, and Burke, explicitly by name, based on that accumulated body of DNA evidence spanning multiple independent testing rounds. Her letter stated plainly and unambiguously that the presence of matching male DNA found on 2 separate items of clothing worn by JonBenet at the exact time of her death made clear that an unknown male had directly handled those specific items, and that there existed no plausible innocent explanation for its incriminating presence at 2 entirely separate locations. To the extent that we may have contributed in any way to the public perception that you might have been involved in this crime, I am deeply sorry. Lacey wrote directly to the family. This letter remains to this day one of the most notable, most formally documented exonerations in the entire history of American criminal justice, and it specifically named Burke as one of the 3 family members it formally cleared, a fact that genuinely deserves far more sustained public attention than it typically receives in casual coverage of this case, then or now. It's worth being genuinely fair, complete, and intellectually honest here, because responsible coverage of this specific case requires openly acknowledging real complexity rather than presenting only one convenient side of an admittedly nuanced forensic picture. Not every single official within Colorado's justice system since 2008 has treated that specific DNA evidence as an absolute, permanently case-closing conclusion regarding the family's complete and total innocence in every conceivable sense. The family is not, and has not been for many years now, considered active suspects. That specific part of the record is genuinely settled and uncontested. But the actual DNA quantities involved in the original testing were extremely small, and several credentialed experts have raised the legitimate possibility of contamination occurring during the manufacturing process, given that both specific pieces of clothing had been recently purchased and had notably never been washed before that night. In 2009, the Boulder Police Department, upon resuming primary control of the investigation from the district attorney's office, publicly stated that it did not consider the existing DNA evidence fully conclusive entirely on its own merits. That somewhat more institutionally cautious position exists genuinely alongside the formal 2008 exoneration letter, and both perspectives are legitimately, honestly part of the complete, documented historical record on this specific question. What has never once wavered, however, across every single round of independent forensic testing conducted over nearly 3 full decades now, is Burke's own specific individual exclusion from that unidentified male DNA profile. Whatever legitimate ongoing professional debate genuinely exists among forensic experts about how conclusively that DNA evidence definitively points toward one specific outside perpetrator, no version whatsoever of that particular ongoing debate has ever, at any point, produced a single shred of evidence connecting Burke himself to his sister's death. That specific, crucial distinction matters enormously, and it is frequently and unfortunately lost entirely within casual online discussion of this broader case. It's also genuinely worth directly addressing and then dismissing with equal directness and clarity. Something that has circulated persistently online for years now, an elaborate and highly specific theory, originating from an entirely unverified source describing themselves publicly as a former intelligence analyst, alleging a detailed, coordinated cover-up scenario involving the entire Ramsey family, including Burke as a 9-year-old child at the time. This particular theory has never been supported by any physical evidence whatsoever. It has never been formally presented in any actual court proceeding. It has never been endorsed, even partially, by a single law enforcement agency genuinely connected to this case. And critically, it stands directly, fundamentally contradicted by the consistent DNA evidence itself, which has never once matched Burke, his father John, or his mother Patsy across any round of independent testing. Responsible, fact-based reporting simply does not repeat unverified, uncorroborated online accusations as though they somehow carry the same evidentiary weight as established, forensically confirmed fact. And this analysis won't either. Let's talk honestly, specifically, and with real precision about the one piece of evidence most frequently and persistently connected specifically to Burke, because it genuinely deserves careful, accurate treatment rather than the vague, insinuating implication it typically receives across online discussion of this case. The original autopsy found partially digested pineapple present in JonBenet's stomach, suggesting, based on standard digestion timing, that she had likely eaten it somewhere between roughly 1 and 2 hours before her death, a finding that directly conflicted with her parents' consistent account that she had gone straight to bed, fully asleep, immediately upon returning home that night. A bowl containing pineapple chunks was subsequently found sitting on the family's kitchen table the following morning, bearing identifiable fingerprints from both Burke and his mother Patsy. JonBenet's own fingerprints were notably not found anywhere on that specific bowl. This particular detail has genuinely fascinated true crime audiences for nearly 3 decades now, and it's honestly easy to understand exactly why. It strongly suggests JonBenet was, in fact, awake at some specific point after the family initially returned home that night, directly contradicting her parents' consistently stated official timeline. But it remains critically important to be precise, specifically, about what this particular piece of evidence actually proves, and, just as importantly, what it categorically does not prove. It establishes, with reasonable forensic confidence, that JonBenet likely did eat pineapple at some specific point that night. It establishes that Burke's fingerprints were, in fact, present on that particular bowl. It does not establish precisely when those specific fingerprints were originally left on the bowl, relative to any other event occurring that same night. It does not establish whether Burke and JonBenet were even together in the same room at that specific moment. It does not establish what, if anything at all, actually occurred directly between them. And critically, it establishes absolutely no forensic connection whatsoever to the specific fatal injuries JonBenet ultimately suffered several hours later that night. Fingerprints found on a shared family kitchen bowl inside a family's own private home simply are not, on their own, meaningful evidence of any kind of violent encounter having occurred. They constitute evidence that a 9-year-old child touched a bowl in his own family's kitchen, an entirely unremarkable act requiring absolutely no sinister explanation whatsoever, and one that could just as plausibly reflect a completely innocent, unremarkable late-night snack shared between 2 siblings before anything else whatsoever occurred that tragic night. There's also been long-standing, persistent public debate for years surrounding certain enhanced audio recovered from the family's original 911 emergency call, with some independent analysts claiming that faint background audio, captured after the primary call itself, had technically ended, but before the phone line fully disconnected, includes what sounds like a voice resembling Burke's own, seemingly directly contradicting the family's consistent, repeated account that he remained asleep throughout the entirety of that night's events. This specific piece of ambiguous audio evidence has been carefully reviewed by multiple independent audio forensic experts over the following decades, with genuinely no unanimous professional conclusion ever reached regarding what those faint, inherently ambiguous background sounds actually capture or definitively confirm about anything specific. No official investigative body and no court of law has ever treated this particular piece of audio as established, reliable evidence of anything specific or definitive whatsoever regarding Burke's actual whereabouts or level of awareness that particular morning. What's genuinely remarkable when you methodically lay out this entire documented record in full detail like this is precisely how thin the actual substantive case against Burke Ramsey has always genuinely been, once decades of accumulated online speculation are carefully set aside, and one looks strictly, exclusively at what has actually been forensically established through legitimate scientific testing and formal legal proceedings. He was scientifically excluded by direct DNA testing all the way back in 1999, a full 17 years before CBS's specific documentary ever aired its central theory to the American public. He was formally, publicly, explicitly cleared by name in the official 2008 exoneration letter, an authoritative, on-record document issued directly by the Boulder County District Attorney's own office. No physical evidence of any kind, no fingerprint at the actual scene of the fatal injury itself, no DNA evidence whatsoever connecting him to the actual murder weapon or ligature, no credible witness testimony of any kind, has ever placed Burke specifically at the exact location or precise moment of his sister's death in any way whatsoever, suggesting his direct personal involvement in causing her fatal injuries. The entire theory that gained sudden, widespread mainstream national traction in 2016 rested almost entirely on circumstantial inference and carefully staged televised demonstration, precisely the specific kind of evidentiary foundation that ultimately led CBS's own legal team to settle a genuinely historic defamation claim rather than defend the documentary's specific conclusions before a jury at trial. This particular set of facts matters for a reason that genuinely extends well beyond simply dryly setting the historical record straight for its own sake. It matters because Burke Ramsey has spent essentially his entire adult life, more than 2 full decades now and counting, carrying the accumulated unfair weight of a theory that the strongest, most consistently available physical evidence has never, at any single point, actually supported in any meaningful way. He was 9 years old when his younger sister was brutally murdered inside their own family home. He grew up, throughout his entire adolescence, with news trucks periodically parked directly outside his family's house, with tabloid photographs of himself as a young, innocent child displayed prominently on supermarket newsstands, directly alongside images of his own murdered sister, and eventually, as a young adult in his late 20s, he personally watched a major American television network dedicate 6 full hours of national primetime programming to a carefully constructed theory publicly suggesting he might have personally killed his own sister, a theory his own legal team ultimately believed was legally vulnerable enough to justify pursuing an unprecedented $750 million lawsuit against one of America's largest and most powerful media companies. Where does all of this genuinely leave things today, specifically in 2026, nearly 3 full decades removed from that tragic Christmas night in Boulder? Burke Ramsey, now in his late 30s, lives a genuinely quiet, deliberately private life in Michigan, working steadily in technology management according to public records independently reviewed and confirmed by multiple major news outlets covering his current circumstances. He has continued, consistently and without exception, to decline all media appearances connected in any way to this case, most recently and notably turning down a direct invitation to participate in Netflix's major new documentary series, despite that specific project's explicitly more sympathetic, more evidence-based framing toward him personally. His father, John Ramsey, now 82 years old, has become significantly, dramatically more publicly active over just the past 2 years specifically, pushing publicly and specifically for forensic genetic genealogy testing on the unidentified male DNA that has remained genuinely unmatched since 1997. Meeting personally with Boulder's current police chief, and even publicly appealing directly to federal officials for meaningful assistance in finally moving this case towards some kind of genuine, lasting resolution after nearly 30 years. This past summer specifically, that broader push gained renewed, significant public attention after a Colorado Bureau of Investigation forensic analyst pleaded guilty to multiple serious felony charges connected directly to mishandling DNA evidence across more than 1,000 entirely unrelated criminal cases, spanning nearly 2 full decades of her employment at that specific agency. Both the Boulder Police Department and the Boulder County District Attorney's Office confirmed publicly and directly, after conducting their own thorough internal review, that JonBenet's specific case evidence was not meaningfully affected by this particular analyst's documented misconduct, since the earliest and most forensically critical DNA testing in this specific case had actually been conducted years earlier by a completely independent private laboratory located in Virginia, not by the Colorado State Crime Lab at all. Burke, by clear, consistent, and genuinely notable contrast to his own father's recent, increasingly public advocacy, has chosen an entirely different path altogether, stepping back further and further into deliberate privacy rather than stepping forward into public advocacy, a choice that remains entirely understandable, reasonable, and genuinely defensible, given his own very specific, extensively documented personal history with media coverage of this particular case. His father lost a daughter and has now spent nearly 30 years fighting, increasingly publicly and with growing urgency, for meaningful answers about who ultimately took her life. Burke lost a younger sister at just 9 years old and has instead spent nearly 30 years simply trying to quietly build an ordinary adult life that isn't permanently defined by a horrific crime he had absolutely no documented part in causing, according to literally every single piece of physical, forensic evidence this case has ever produced across multiple independent testing rounds spanning nearly 3 full decades now. The DNA evidence sitting at the very center of this entire ongoing investigation, the specific physical proof that an unidentified male individual had direct physical contact with JonBenet's body and clothing around the precise time of her death, remains genuinely unmatched to this very day in 2026. It has never, at any single point across multiple entirely independent testing rounds spanning nearly 30 years, pointed toward Burke in any way whatsoever. It has never pointed toward either of his parents. Investigators have not, to this day, named a single specific suspect. No arrest has been made in nearly 3 decades. And as forensic genetic genealogy, the exact same specific technology that successfully identified the Golden State Killer decades after his own crimes were originally committed, continues to be discussed publicly and seriously as a genuinely viable potential path forward for finally, definitively resolving this long unsolved case. Burke Ramsey's own name genuinely deserves to be understood and discussed accurately, based entirely on what has actually been forensically established over nearly 3 decades of investigation, rather than based on a single, now nearly decade-old documentary theory that Burke's own historically large, successfully settled legal claim strongly suggests even CBS's own experienced legal counsel ultimately understood to be significantly legally vulnerable at the time. It's worth genuinely stepping back, one final time, and carefully considering exactly what this specific chapter of the much broader ongoing Ramsey case actually illustrates, well beyond just the individual personal details of Burke's own specific story. It stands as a genuinely instructive, appropriately cautionary example of precisely how quickly unsupported speculation, once broadcast at truly massive national scale, can permanently attach itself to an individual person's entire public identity, entirely regardless of what the underlying consistent physical evidence actually and repeatedly shows over time. Burke Ramsey was formally excluded by rigorous DNA testing years, and in fact nearly 2 full decades, before CBS's specific documentary ever aired its central theory to the broader American public. That prior, definitive scientific exclusion didn't ultimately stop that specific unproven theory from being broadcast directly into millions of American households on national primetime television. It ultimately took a historic $750 million lawsuit and several additional years of formal legal proceedings to even partially, and only privately, address the very real, lasting damage that single 6-hour broadcast caused to one specific man's public reputation and personal life, a man who was, again, only 9 years old on the actual night his younger sister tragically died, and who has never once, across any single round of forensic testing conducted in nearly 3 decades, been connected to her death by any physical evidence whatsoever. This particular story is also, quite honestly and directly, fundamentally a story about profound personal grief that has never once been genuinely allowed to simply exist as grief, entirely uncomplicated by relentless public suspicion and continuous media speculation. Burke Ramsey lost his 6-year-old younger sister in the most violent, sudden, and subsequently permanently public way imaginable for any young child to ever personally experience. He then spent the following 3 full decades of his life watching that profound, deeply personal loss get repeatedly, continuously reframed by countless others around him, first as sensationalized tabloid fodder throughout his entire childhood and adolescence, later as dramatic primetime documentary speculation as a young adult navigating his late 20s, and now, still today in 2026, as ongoing, recurring subject matter for an essentially endless stream of online true crime content and commentary, much of which continues, even now, to raise his specific name directly in connection with a crime, the consistent forensic evidence has genuinely never once, across nearly 30 years, actually tied him to in any meaningful way. His considered decision to decline participation in the new Netflix documentary isn't evasion, and it certainly isn't guilt. Based on absolutely everything documented about his own specific, extensively verified history with media coverage of this particular case, it reads instead as a firm, genuinely hard-won personal boundary, deliberately set by a man who has already, once before in his own life, had to formally sue a major national television network just to meaningfully push back against unproven, damaging speculation broadcast at massive national scale about his own innocent childhood self. For his father, John Ramsey, the ongoing fight continues to be genuinely public, urgent, and increasingly specific in its precise focus, centered squarely on advanced DNA technology, specialized laboratory capabilities, and the specific institutional bottlenecks he personally believes continue to stand between this long unsolved case and its final, lasting resolution after nearly 30 years of waiting. For Burke, by clear contrast, the ongoing personal fight has taken on a fundamentally different, much quieter shape entirely, simply trying day by day to live an ordinary adult life, 3 full decades now removed from a devastating childhood tragedy that was, according to literally every single piece of physical evidence this case has ever produced across multiple entirely independent testing rounds, genuinely never something he had any actual part whatsoever in causing. Both of these very different responses represent entirely legitimate, deeply human reactions to an experience that most people can honestly barely even imagine enduring even once in their lifetime, let alone across 3 full decades of continued, largely unrelenting public attention and periodic, recurring, renewed speculation. So what is the actual, genuinely complete truth about Burke Ramsey 3 full decades later? When you carefully set aside decades of accumulated online speculation entirely and look strictly, exclusively at the actual documented historical record, it's genuinely this. A 9-year-old boy lost his younger sister in December of 1996, under circumstances no child should ever, under any conceivable scenario, have to personally experience. He was investigated, entirely reasonably, as any close family member reasonably would be in a case genuinely showing no clear evidence whatsoever of forced entry into the home, a standard, appropriate, entirely necessary step in any competently conducted homicide investigation. He was formally, scientifically excluded by rigorous DNA testing in 1999, years before any major public theory implicating him personally ever gained any meaningful traction whatsoever. He was formally, publicly exonerated explicitly by name in an official 2008 letter issued directly by the Boulder County District Attorney's own office. He was nonetheless, 17 full years after his own scientific DNA exclusion, made the central subject of a major national network documentary theory, broadcast nationally in 2016, a theory he ultimately, successfully, and expensively challenged through a genuinely historic defamation lawsuit that was eventually settled under undisclosed terms, rather than fought through to a public jury verdict that CBS's own experienced legal team may well have privately believed it could realistically lose. He broke his own extended public silence exactly once, in that same pivotal year of 2016, speaking with genuine, unguarded candor about his beloved sister, about the sheer chaos of that unforgettable December morning, and about the relentless, invasive media scrutiny that had fundamentally shaped his entire childhood and adolescence. And today, in 2026, he lives quietly and privately, works steadily in technology management, and has made the entirely deliberate, well-documented, and completely understandable personal choice to stay entirely out of the ongoing, seemingly endless media cycle surrounding his own sister's still tragically unsolved murder, even as his own father continues to push publicly and with growing urgency for the specific DNA breakthrough that might, after nearly 3 full decades of waiting, finally, definitively identify who actually did this. That's the genuine, complete truth built carefully and entirely from documented interviews, official court records, formal forensic testing results, and Burke's own limited but remarkably consistent public statements, rather than from decades of accumulated, unproven speculation, carefully staged television reconstructions, or genuinely ambiguous audio analysis that no court or official investigative body has ever formally validated as reliable evidence. It's honestly a far less dramatically sensational story than the various theories that have circulated persistently online for years now, and it doesn't offer the kind of neat, dramatic resolution that true crime content so often promises its audience. It's also, quite simply and quite importantly, the genuinely accurate one, grounded entirely and exclusively in what has actually, formally been proven through legitimate scientific testing and legal process, rather than in what has merely been repeated often enough across online platforms to eventually start sounding true to casual observers. If this deep dive gave you a clearer, more accurate, and more complete picture of who Burke Ramsey actually is today, based genuinely on documented facts rather than years of accumulated circulating speculation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you catch our continued coverage of this case as it develops going forward. Hit that like button if you genuinely believe people deserve to be covered based on solid evidence rather than unproven theory, especially when that specific person was a 9-year-old child at the very center of a tragedy he had no documented part whatsoever in causing. And let me know honestly, directly in the comments below, now that you've actually heard his own documented words and the complete accurate forensic record laid out fully and in real detail, has your own personal understanding of Burke Ramsey genuinely changed at all? Remember, underneath every headline, every documentary, and every online theory this case has generated over the last 30 years, there remains a real family that lost a beloved child in the most devastating way imaginable. And there remains a real, living man, now in his late 30s, who was once simply a 9-year-old boy asleep in his own bed on the single worst night of his entire family's life. JonBenet Ramsey genuinely deserves justice, and the consistent, repeatedly confirmed physical evidence in this case continues to point directly towards someone who has never, across nearly 30 years of active investigation, actually been identified. Burke Ramsey genuinely deserves to finally be seen and understood for exactly what the actual documented evidence has clearly shown for more than 25 years running now, not as a suspect of any kind, but simply as a brother who tragically lost his younger sister far too young, and who has quietly spent his entire adult life trying to find some private place to genuinely grieve her, far away from cameras and unproven speculation that have never once, across nearly 3 full decades, actually had the real evidence needed to justify pointing in his direction.